Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. You can find Natasha on Facebook at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CSTS, and at Natasha Helfer MFT on Instagram and TikTok. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for this episode is by Otter Creek. This podcast was edited by Ashley Pacini.
Hello, everyone. This is Natasha Helfer. I'm a relational and sex therapist, and this is my podcast where we try to attack shame and get healthier through education, stories, and relationships. And today I have a lot of that going on. I have the relationship with my own kiddo. So I'm super excited to welcome Rowan Helfer Parker onto the podcast and get to introduce everybody to this person that I am just thrilled about having in my life. And today we're going to talk a lot about kind of the coming out process that Rowan had with their journey with me, specifically as their parent. I think what we're hoping to hopefully have a goal be here is that sometimes people might think that somebody like me who's a sex therapist or a sex educator or whatever must have all the answers, must do it all super well, right?
No mistakes ever.
No mistakes ever, right? And the reality is that I've made plenty of mistakes. I think one of your favorite things that you say, Rowan, in life is just mistakes have been made. So mistakes have definitely been made. When it comes to your journey and communicating with me as your mom. Yeah, so we're going to try to go there today. So welcome. Hi.
Thank you. Hi. It's really exciting to be talking about this. So I use they, them pronouns just to kind of, as a starter, I want to make that clear. I know my mom has been using my pronouns correctly, which is really nice. I do want to say, before we get into kind of my story, that I want to emphasize this is my story. It's very unique to me, and it's not going to reflect every trans story out there. And there are plenty of trans people who will look at my experience and go, I don't relate to that at all. And then there are plenty of trans people who will relate to it. So I'm not trying to speak for the trans community by any means or by any stretch, or the queer community in general. Just kind of sharing my experience and trying to hopefully help people be a bit less scared about this process.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I think that's kind of a reality, right? Like no matter what demographic we fit into, on the one hand, we represent that demographic, and on the other hand, we don't, right?
Right.
We're not the end all be all when it comes to either being, a minority in any sense of the word. So, all right. So let's get started maybe talking about when we decided maybe to do this.
Right.
Which was a while ago now. We thought, wow, we might talk about this. Well, and even before we go there, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, like what you're doing in your current life?
Yeah.
And then maybe from there, why don't you tell us a little bit about what got you grumpy enough with me that we thought about doing this podcast?
For sure. So I'm currently a student at the University of Utah. I am studying biology with an emphasis on ecology, evolution, and the environment. I've got about 2 weeks left of that before I graduate, which is pretty exciting. And then for the past year and a half, I've had the opportunity to work at the Natural History Museum of Utah as the curatorial assistant of their vertebrate zoology department. So that's been really cool as well. Just getting to get that hands-on experience. I've got plenty of really, really gross, terrible stories that I could tell you and be very excited to tell you that I'm going to refrain from here. I'll keep it PG. But the amount of horrifying pictures I have on my phone from all of my dissections is kind of funny.
Yeah, may not for everybody be horrifying, but for me it is. I've got a queasy stomach. That's funny. All right. Yeah. So why don't you, and you're about to graduate. We're super proud of you. You're like a super smart kid. Tell me about what happened. Let's talk a little bit about, so 2 years ago, I was going through my own kind of disaster process with the LDS Mormon Church. Right. And getting excommunicated. And so as part of that, I went on a lot of different shows, podcast shows and news kind of media outlets. and was talking quite a bit about my life, right? And what had led to my kind of being in the position that I was in. So, and a big part of my story includes you and other LGBTQ people that I have been kind of in a space of advocacy for much of my career, probably not all of my career, but much of my career, and speaking out about how to be more supportive and being allies of LGBTQ plus members. So in that process, why don't you go ahead and share kind of what was upsetting to you, and then maybe we'll go back and talk about our history in general.
Right. So I don't remember which podcast it was exactly, but I remember seeing a video of you talking about your experience with a queer kid in the Mormon church, essentially. And you started off by saying, my kid goes by Rowan now, and she uses they, them pronouns. But back then, she used she, her pronouns and went by dead name. And then for the rest of the interview, referred to me with pronouns that I don't use anymore and a name that I don't use anymore, which is a very hurtful thing to hear. It's something that, like, among the trans community, I think a lot of us understand that they're called a dead name because we want them to stay dead. And even when you're referring to people before they came out, you should still use the terminology that they're using now. So that was something that, to have not just something where it's a family member discussing me in general, but it's a recorded public, hundreds of thousands of people are able to access that material. And so it added another level to it for sure.
Yeah, so thinking I was being so careful of how I was going to talk about you and your history, I made a decision to use your birth name, which is now called your dead name, during the time that you had associated with that name, thinking that was okay, and then only shifting to your current name, given the timeline. And what you're saying is, faux pas, mom, not good.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Like, that's painful. It's painful for people, who identify on the trans spectrum and non-binary spectrum, to be reminded on a regular basis about your dead name, right? And so it's not very fun or pleasurable to kind of hear that, even if it is timeline accurate. Right. So that's kind of one thing that you're sharing with people, like, if people can understand, like, once the transition has been made, once the person has said, this is the preference of my name or my pronouns, now from forever, we start sharing that as the name, correct?
Yeah, exactly. I think that a big part of it is, I don't know how many strangers I'm going to run across. Like, I've met people who know you. It doesn't happen a ton, but I do come across people who know you from time to time. And there is that kind of fear now of, like, ooh, I wonder if they know what my name used to be and how they're going to address me. It's already hard enough, I think, knowing that, at least for me at this moment, I have no plans for medical transition. So for strangers who look at me, they will probably always see a woman, even though that's not how I identify. And that's already a very painful thing to kind of grapple with and feel okay with, as just a reality of how our society is set up at this time. To then have on top of that, like, they might know what I used to call myself. When it's a lot easier if I can just introduce myself as Rowan, and that's the only name that they ever know me by.
Right. And that is, I mean, so obviously I have apologized for this, but one thing where I made, a mistake that impacted your life. So let's continue kind of with the roasting process. Of your mother. So, and in that you can just talk about society, because I think a lot of these things are societal things in general anyway. Yeah. So why don't you just, as much as you're comfortable, kind of share your coming out process? And there's so many ideas these days about what it means to be what gender identity means, what it means to be trans or non-binary. And there also seem to be kind of like a lot of markers, like kind of like what you're saying, like you have to look a certain way to be deemed a certain gender. Or, people will say, well, but was this something that you were feeling when you were 3 or 4 or 5? Because if not, we're not gonna make it real. It must not be real then, if you were older than when you were a little kid, when you started having some of these ideas or thoughts. Of course, there's a lot of speculation by a lot of people who are not very informed in regards to gender identity things, that this is a phase, or that this is kind of or it's an epidemic that's happening, right? So anyway, there's a lot of things. So maybe we'll talk about some of these things as you also just talk about your journey and what it was like to have a somewhat nuanced Mormon mom for a while, and then more of a nuanced mom, and then more of an ally. But I wasn't, I don't think that I was always where you needed me to be.
Right.
So, roast away.
Well, I think that it was a pretty young age I realized that I realized I had attraction to feminine-bodied people, to AFAB individuals. And I didn't really know what to do with that information. I think being really young, you kind of, at least for me, I kind of just assumed like, oh, well, everybody thinks that girls are hot. Like, that's just a normal experience, right? And I think I remember asking you when I was little, like, do you think girls' butts are hot? And you were just like, no, I don't. And I was like, oh. And I didn't really talk about it after that for a bit, because I was just like, I had to mull over that for a bit. But when I went to my high school, I switched from a very like white bubble kind of high school to the downtown high school due to some honors program that I got into. And they had a gay straight alliance club. And I decided to go thinking like, oh, I can't wait to be a good ally. I'm going to be such an amazing ally, and definitely not a part of this group for sure. But no, really quickly, I was like, okay, yeah, I have definitely got some bisexuality going on. And I think that at the time, the big thing, because this was in 2013, almost 10 years ago, the big thing was a phase, right? Like it's all a phase. That's the main narrative that I was kind of hearing about queer people, was that like, oh, you start doing this coming of age process, and maybe you have friends who are queer that you then want to be queer, and just kind of a trend. And so I had a lot of doubts about my own identity. And then when I came to you about it, I think we were driving somewhere, and I just said, Mom, I think I might like girls. And your reaction was to basically say, well, give it some time. This might just be a phase. And so that was very hurtful in the moment, because it was kind of confirming all of the doubts that I had, that maybe I was just faking it for attention, because that's what everybody, thought that bisexual people do. I think it's something that really hits bisexual people hard, because a lot of people look at bi individuals and think, well, you're still half straight, so it doesn't really matter that you're queer, which is obviously not true. But yeah, I would say that was the first kind of blunder. I waited 5 years after that to come out to my dad as bisexual, and his reaction was essentially, well, who are you going to marry, a man or a woman? And I was like, oh, I can't look into the future, so I don't know. So it's just kind of from both sides, I would say, very different reactions that had negative connotations in different ways. So then when I started to explore my gender in my junior year of high school, I was not going to tell anyone except for very close friends. So my junior year, I actually went by he, him pronouns, and I used the name Aro, which I thought was very clever, and I kind of look back at and think is kind of stupid. But I was that person for a year. I explored that. I remember I was taking an art class, and I would sign my pieces of work with a little like a signature that basically made the A look like an I, so they could kind of switch between the name I was using and my dead name. So if people ask questions, I could be like, oh no, yeah, it's my initials. It's it's IP instead of AP. So I did a lot of hiding, I think, and that made it very easy for me to get into a relationship with someone who wasn't very great, and then kind of have that identity crumble very quickly. And I went back to my dead name and referring to myself with she, her pronouns, which I was never really comfortable with after that. It was really hard to really feel okay with that decision. So it took a few more years before I started to, I started going by just Parker as my last name with my close friends for a bit. And it just took me a long time to really come to the realization of like, yeah, I don't feel like I completely fit into the male category or the female category. And I think it was at that point I kind of learned more about the non-binary gender identity and they them pronouns, because even when I was in high school, that was something that was not really a big thing. I would have English teachers talk about how they them pronouns are not grammatically correct, which is false. They are correct. We've been using they them pronouns for singular beings for as long as English has been around. So I came out to you and Dad, I think at the same time, in like a therapy session because I was so nervous about it. And I think the initial reaction to that was pretty okay. I remember Dad saying that he really believed in the biology, didn't really understand the difference between sex and gender identity. So that was kind of hard to hear. But I think the hardest thing for me now that I'm out to kind of everybody is that it's been 2.5 years since I came out to everyone. And I feel like she, her pronouns are something that kind of stick with me a bit more than my name has. My name, people have done very well with switching from my dead name to my true name. But you still mess up my pronouns, you know, people in the house still mess up my pronouns. People I don't see often mess up my pronouns even more because they're not around me as much. But yeah, I can't really think of anyone that I know who is not queer who gets my pronouns right all the time. It's kind of interesting. I think that for queer people, it's really easy to, or at least in my experience with my queer friends, it's very simple to do this switch for someone to say, hey, I don't want to use these pronouns anymore, because it's something that we've ruminated on so long. We've thought about our own identities for so long. It's very easy to then completely respect and validate those people's identities without having to make a lot of mistakes to get there. Which I think is a big issue with straight cis people, because you don't have that same questioning journey that makes it easier to accept other people's journeys.
Yeah, for sure. So you talked about a lot of things. I want to kind of go back and revisit a few things. You mentioned AFAB. Can you just share a little bit what that language means? And maybe not everybody who listens to my podcast knows those terms.
For sure. So there's definitely been like lots of switch ups in the trans terminology, which I know that for cisgender people who identify as the gender they were assigned at birth, they struggle with terminology, which is completely understandable. So AFAB means assigned female at birth. So I am AFAB. When I was born, on my birth certificate it says female. AMAB means assigned male at birth. So that's basically a way to say, like, I'm trans. I didn't used to be female because that's not how I view myself. I have always been non-binary to myself. That's how I view my experience. It's just that for a long time, people thought that I was female. if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think what you're also describing with maybe like some of the reactions you received where it was like, well, if you're bi, then can't you just be with a guy type of a thing? Or, I think there's a term called bi erasure
Yeah.
that, is kind of exploring how when people say they're bisexual, the larger community will kind of push or expect the person to still act in kind of heteronormative ways and will
Mhm.
ignore the other things as being important since you like both and you have one, isn't that okay enough? Do you want to talk a little bit
Right.
about bi erasure and how that shows up
Yeah.
in your
I
life?
think I think bi erasure is really interesting because it shows up both ways. I think for people who are not non-celebrity, it's usually heteronormative. It doesn't really matter that you're bi because you can still date the person of your opposite sex, and that's what we consider okay. But if you look at certain celebrities, like the one thing I always think of is Freddie Mercury was a bisexual man. He multiple times said that he was bisexual. And yet our entire narrative about Freddie Mercury is that he was gay, which to me feels very wrong to erase how he identified as himself. So it definitely goes both ways in that sense, and it's incredibly hurtful. It's something that even exists within the queer community. I know that like straight passing couples attending pride events might get a little bit more trouble than queer passing couples, right? If a bisexual individual, if a bisexual woman is dating a man, then that's a straight passing couple, even though one of those people, maybe both of those people, are queer. So it can be really difficult to feel fully accepted in your own community and then understood by everybody else.
Yeah, for sure. And it seems like in several instances, like you were asking questions that either I didn't pick up on, or maybe even with my own biases, like chose to sweep under the rug, even my subconscious rug, because I don't ever, just so you know, I don't ever remember purposefully sweeping something under the proverbial rug. But
Right.
you were asking questions, you're saying from a pretty young age, even when you were little, like, Mom, do you find, female butts attractive or whatever? And then maybe you share something about your bisexuality with me or your parents in general. And then depending on how we answer or the kind of general aura you get from us,
Mhm.
um, you kind of get the message, maybe this isn't safe territory. Maybe this isn't what I want to keep on asking about, or maybe this isn't a space where I really want to go further. You
Mhm.
mentioned kind of reverting back even throughout your teen years. A lot of
Mhm.
what you describe in your teen years, I wasn't even really aware of, right? Like I wasn't
Right.
aware that you were using this other name at school or
Mhm.
amongst your friends. And so one thing I try to talk to parents a lot about is that, granted, we're not perfect either, but a lot of how we respond will give the kid an idea of whether or not they can continue to ask more questions or offer more about their identity or orientation. So I'm guessing you relate to that, right? Like, your parents probably weren't the worst out there. We didn't like, hopefully, ostracize you or threaten you,
No.
with punishment or anything like that. But just the fact that we weren't as open as we maybe otherwise could be kind of limited your ability to communicate with us.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It was definitely a combination of factors. I would say partially because I was having those questions that then weren't really um, responded to in a sort of positive way. Like I remember um, bringing up the concept of drag queens to you one night when we were taking some of the Mormon kids home, like some Mormon neighbors home, and you kind of said you shouldn't talk about that in front of them because then they're going to go ask their parents about what a drag queen is, and that's inappropriate, right? So there's a lot of messaging around something about queerness is inappropriate for people to hear about, for people to talk about, which is, I mean, it's very difficult to think like that my gender identity or my sexual identity is not appropriate. It's fine for straight people to be around children. So, it's just a weird thing that I think is a very cultural issue that also I think stopped me from sharing more about my identity, but also seeing how other parents responded. So I have a very good friend who is trans, and he came out to his family in high school, and it was horrible. It was a really horrific experience that he shared a lot with me because we were very close. We still are. So I remember being really nervous then that, like, okay, well, his parents were okay with gay people. It was just trans people they weren't okay with. So even people who are somewhat understanding can have these explosive, terrible reactions. And I think it's a combination of factors: societal, relationships, just lots of fear around the idea of coming out.
Yeah. I I think, well, I wonder if would you be interested, and it's okay if you say no because we didn't really pre-plan this interview, but would you be interested in sharing kind of some of your journey within the LDS Mormon Church in regards to all of this? Maybe not just your parents, but
Mhm.
what you were hearing at church and what ended up kind of being the last chapters of your relationship with the church?
Yeah, yeah. So I was in the church really. I was passionate about the church until I was 14. And a lot of the messaging I got about queer people was, you know, obviously we love everyone, but it says here that a man and a woman are the people who should be together. So God isn't very happy, I'm sure, with these people. So that's kind of the messaging I heard, was like, we still love them. It's just that God's not happy with them, or that, there's something that they're doing that's not quite right. So there was always a bit of separation. I think that growing up with you as a mother in the Mormon church was very interesting, like having that bit of rebellious side to me, because I knew that you were standing up against a lot of the rhetoric that they were teaching. And like, I remember when we both wore pants to church together, like as a little kind of protest, right? So there was a combination of ideas, of very conservative ideas, and then, kind of liberating with you being who you are. And it was kind of out of nowhere. When I was 14, that's when I started going to high school. So I joined GSA, and I went to my first Pride event that year, which was really incredible for me. And I posted pictures on my Facebook, because I was a teenager, and that's what you do when you're a teenager now. And then a few months later, I decided to post a profile on the Ordained Women movement, which I just basically said that I was, in support of giving women equal rights to these religious ceremonies as men, because I mean, I still believe in that. But at the time, I was also the Maya Maid president, and that was a really cool thing for me to be. I took it very seriously. I'd never gotten the chance to be a leader before. All of my friends, had already been called before I was. So I said in my Ordained Women movement profile that I'm a Maya Maid president, because I was proud of it. And then a couple Sundays later, the bishop called me into his office, under the guise of it just being a birthday interview, because you had requested, Mom, that they never take us into the office alone. But they managed to get me in there alone. And for basically an hour to an hour and a half, we discussed my profile and my pictures that I put up from the Pride event. And at first, the message that I was getting was, well, it wasn't okay for you to say you were a Maya Maid leader, because that implies an authority. You're an authority figure saying that you stand up for this movement. And so 14-year-old me was kind of like, okay, I kind of get that but it felt very weird. It felt like a very mature thing to worry about at that age. So he was very angry about that, and we just discussed that for a while, and then it kind of took me by surprise, I think, when he said, and I looked at your Facebook profile and found your pride pictures. So my bishop went to my Facebook profile and was like scrolling through pictures. And so he started questioning me about, have you ever had same-sex attraction, which I denied at the time because I was terrified and at this point probably already crying, just because I know I'm a person who cries pretty easily. And he said, do you believe that gay people should have equal rights? And I said yes. And he really grilled me about that for a very long time and made the argument that it wasn't something I should have believed or that it should have been important to me. And then finally they let you know that I was in that room, and you came in, and I think you had thought that I had gone to the bishop myself because you didn't think there was any other way that I could have been in that room alone. So when you realized what had happened, I would say, like, this is probably the most positive experience I have with both my parents regarding my queerness, is that both you and Dad absolutely blew up. You were so angry. You were so livid that they did this, that they bypassed a hard limit that you had set for what you wanted your children to experience in the church, and that they had been grilling me for so long. I remember Dad actually asked us both to leave so that he could yell at the bishop like on his own. So it was really hard to like kind of formally be rejected from that community I had grown up in. And at the same time, because of the support that you and Dad showed, I felt very, very confident in my decision to like never go back and never question my support of these movements ever again.
Well, and to be clear, he basically fired you from your job, right? I mean, he took
Yeah.
away your calling, right? That was
Yeah.
part of what was going to be happening as part of the consequence to your positions. And also, to be clear, I think it's important, like, were these things you were talking about with the young women? Were these things that you were bringing to young women's, Sunday classes and talking about ordained women, or talking about your gay, straight support network at school? I mean, I don't think you were doing those things, but just the fact that you had social media presence or anything like that kind of disqualified you now, according to them.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And even if I had been talking to them about that stuff, I don't think that should have been grounds for removal. Then again, I know that the Mormon church is already a pretty conservative place when it comes to feminist and queer issues, and plenty of other issues as well. But the Mormon church in Kansas has got another level of conservative ideology to it, and it was just, I could see if I had been a bit more open about those ideas that it would have, I would have been fired a lot sooner. But yeah, I had just been on social media about these things.
Yeah. So even though you were raised by an, maybe whatever you'd want to call a progressive Mormon mom, do you want to talk a little bit about what that faith transition was like for you? Because you did, like, you were my made president one day, and I think pretty much through that experience, we all decided we would not go back to a church experience where you were not going to be allowed to be really a participant, a leader, or have callings because of your these social justice positions, which at the time I thought were just positions that you were, ideological positions. I didn't really know very much about your own identity at this point.
Right.
So, do you want to talk a little bit about what impact that had on you? And because even though you got out young, quote unquote, we've talked about how these things have harmed you long term.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the biggest thing for me is still just dealing with a lot of the internalized misogyny and homophobia and transphobia that I grew up with, where I still struggle with kind of viewing myself as fully worthy in certain aspects, which most of that I think I've been able to kind of manage, but definitely in the beginning there was a lot of, I would say, shame. Like I had a whole community of friends that people who grew up in the Mormon church know that usually your whole friend group are all of the Mormon people who are in your age range. And so I pretty much lost all of them overnight because if I wasn't going to go back to church, when was I going to see them? And it was very strange to lose a whole community at that age. I think at the time I felt like I wasn't super bothered by it. I would say that like I might have been in a bit of a culture shock moment because I was going to this totally different high school and making new friends there. So I was kind of like, whatever, I can, I've got new friends at this new place. So F you guys, I don't care. But now, looking back, it's very easy to see where I have been impacted by a lot of the teachings very long term, that I struggle, I struggle being a strong presence sometimes because I feel like I'm sure some subconscious part of me thinks that that's wrong, that I shouldn't have that sort of presence. And I really struggle with like not, I don't know, I struggle with thinking about how into it I was, because I was really into it. And I wonder, was I just really into it because I wanted to like prove that I was the best at something? Because I kind of have this competitive streak to me. But I don't know. I don't really believe in anything now. I don't believe that, like, I'm not atheist where I think that there is no God, but I just think that if there is one, there's no way to tell. So I'm gonna kind of live my own life. So it's something I don't think I've totally grappled with yet, that I probably need to do more work on, just kind of understanding how I switched so quickly, because it was a really fast switch.
Yeah, and to be clear with with the audience, I mean, we lived in a congregation that covered a pretty wide geographic range where kids would go to a lot of different high schools and middle schools. So when you are saying you lost your social support, most of the people you were friends with were not in your school.
Yeah.
So
I don't think there was anybody, especially because I went to a different high school than what was in my like area code, right? So I don't think there was anybody in my ward who went to my high school at all.
yeah, I agree with that. I don't think there was. And even if they did, they would have gone to a different ward boundary or something like that, different state.
Right. Yeah.
I think that it was even in a different state. So, yeah, so it's weird just to even hear you say the words. I don't sometimes I don't feel worthy. I'm like, "Bah!"
Right.
I'm trying to pluck that out of everybody, especially my own kids, right? This idea that we're not worthy somehow, but that is a pretty big thing in kind of Mormon culture, is seeing, I mean, you have these kind of juxtaposed ideas. On the one hand, you're taught that you're a child of God and that you're super important and special, and that you have this whole heavenly parents thing and Jesus who came to sacrifice for you, all the special stuff, like you're so cool. And growing up in somewhat in the young women's program, there's all these, like, you have all these values, right? Like you have, I don't know, like this intrinsic worth, right? That I think you are taught that at some level, while at the same time, we're being taught, like, in order, like you said, to keep God happy or to keep yourself, quote unquote, deemed worthy by the church organization, you have to be adhering to a lot of behavioral standards, but even ideological standards, right? And that probably is where it went against so much of how you were identifying. And I remember being so frustrated at the time, like, here's this kid who's, like a really good student, who isn't even really dating that much, who isn't doing, smoking or drinking alcohol or, stealing cars or whatever we might be afraid teenagers are going to do. But because you were so socially justice oriented, And, obviously coming into your own identity, these ideas that you wouldn't be worthy are really, of course, very angering to me now as your mom. And that, that I was kind of complicit with taking you to a space where you were going to be taught those things. And I can also see how we were arresting your development. We were arresting your sexual development, your kind of erotic development, your gender development, like all these things that you're kind of supposed to be exploring. Like you're saying, you were thinking about them.
Mhm.
And kind of between the ages of like 6 and 26, right? We're exploring a lot of things about ourselves. And yet we were basically saying, oh, no, don't explore yourself. This is who you are. You are a Mormon, you are you are this gender, you are this, and kind of halting or arresting your own developmental process.
Mhm.
I'm guessing you would agree with all that.
Oh, for sure. And I think something I think about a lot when it comes to the Mormon experience as well is like growing up with a very specific role, especially as an AFAB individual assigned female at birth again. I remember at 12 writing down what qualities I wanted to have for my future husband. And that was like one of our activities in church. Or,
Now I have to breathe.
Or we had an object lesson where they brought in brownies, but they were spicy. And that's because, they weren't pure anymore. And I defiantly ate most of the brownies. So there's a lot of messaging that you get about how to exist in femininity that then as a trans individual is very hard to grapple with, because I think that in a lot of ways I reject a lot of the feminine parts of me because I don't like how I was raised to view them. That if I am soft or if I am like fragile, because I mentioned that I cry a lot, and I do. I'm an emotional being. Most people have emotions. But it's very hard to accept that that's okay within my own gender identity. I think that there's a lot of kind of toxic masculinity there, where I put a lot of anti-feminine ideas on my identity because I really hated being in that box for so long that now I've kind of swung in the opposite direction. It's very hard to find a middle ground there where I feel comfortable exploring sort of the fact that I don't have to reject pieces of me just because they look similar to these things that I hated.
Yeah, that's really profound. It's almost like an overcompensation, right? Like if you're pigeonholed into a box, when you come out of that box, it's almost like you're going down the whole pendulum swing instead of being able to land somewhere in the middle.
Right. Right.
Yeah, that's really hard. So, okay, so it sounds like where I made mistakes is, let's kind of review. So when you were a little kid, for example, some of these things I don't even remember. It's interesting to hear you talk. Like I don't remember you asking me if I was attracted to, female bodies or anything like that. But instead of just saying, no, I'm not, maybe I could have asked some more curious questions, right? Or maybe I could have offered some normalizing education, like, well, maybe I don't feel that way, but there are other women who do. I could have said that, right? Or I could have said maybe a spectrum, like, because actually I think I've always found women attractive. So I could say, well, there's different types of attraction. So, obviously I was very focused on the sexual attraction. When you asked me that, if I would have said no. So I could have shared some more things around the different types. So yeah, I feel like I missed an opportunity to educate and to normalize, or to even say something like, but it's okay if you do.
Right.
And you're saying that this happened early, like 6 or 7.
Well, I wouldn't say 6. I would say maybe like 9 or 10.
Okay.
Is when I started to be a bit more vocal about things.
Right. So I think probably another mistake I made at that age was minimizing your sexual exploration and identity. I think we tend to think of kids as, if they haven't hit puberty, as not being sexually or romantically interested in things, which is not true at all, right?
No.
And so People
Yeah.
develop crushes from a very early age. People masturbate from a very early age. People have sexual fantasies from a very early age.
Mhm.
And so I think I was kind of treating you like a person who did not have a sexual component to them.
Right. I
Right.
remember from a very early age, actually, a lot of my sexual fantasies before I understood anything about sex would involve like somehow attaching a penis to me. And that was like an interesting idea. And it's funny to look back at that and think of me as like a really little kid and going, huh, why did I think that I wasn't trans? You know,
Mhm.
it's amazing how much I can see my identity come through in those early moments, because I do think this is something you mentioned at the beginning, but the idea that you have to know your sexual or gender identity at a young age, otherwise it's not valid. That's something that's really stuck to me for a while that I think I've kind of gotten past at this point. Um, because even though I liked dolls and I liked dressing up as a princess when I was a little kid, that is not the entirety of my being, you know. And all of these things are very fluid, and there's ways to interpret how you were when you were a kid that can be very validating, I think.
Well, and why those things have to be considered feminine or masculine to begin with. Why can't everybody
Right.
enjoy playing with dolls? Why can't everybody enjoy dressing up in dresses or in pantaloons or whatever, whatever it is that kind of, with this gender play, why do we have to be in these boxes that are so gender specific, right? Especially when it comes to childhood play, which
Mhm.
so many things are gendered for kids.
Yeah.
And whether it's color or whether it's theme or whether it's even different shows that, well, boys are going to like Transformers, right? And girls are going to like Disney Princess or something, where any gender could like either one of those stories and want to play or play pretend, etc. So yeah, there's a lot there. It also seems like, so the next kind of thing that you remember is coming out to me as bisexual, which I do remember this. And I'll be very upfront. It was probably right at the beginning of maybe my starting sex therapy work myself. So I still had a lot of growth and, figuring out my own biases and my own discriminations. And it's always, of course, I don't know, it's interesting when we have an intimate relationship with something, whereas we have a distanced relationship with something, right? So by the time you had come out to me as bisexual, I was very comfortable with gay and lesbian clients. I was very comfortable advocating for their ability to have their own, romantic and sexual life that wasn't so heteronormative, and starting to have these kind of challenging things that I would start writing in critique of the church's positions, etc. Then it hits home, right? Then it hits home. Then it's like your kid who is going to face discriminations or biases or certain expectations, and then you're having to deal with your own expectations, right, as a parent, where we're, as parents, I mean, why do we have all these gender reveal parties, for example, right? Or why do we want to know the minute the baby's born, does it have a penis or does it have a vagina, right? And so it's like we're wanting, because we're setting up our own ideas about what this kid is going to look like, how we're going to be with this kid. It's fascinating to see the research, about, you hand a person a baby dressed in blue, you hand that same baby dressed in pink to the same person, and they'll interact with that baby very differently, right? Even though it's the same kiddo. So I think in that moment, I had to, whether I realized it or not, I had to deal with my own expectations of what would it mean if Rowan married a girl versus a boy? Or what would it mean if Rowan brings home a girlfriend versus a boyfriend? None of that had sat with any of the expectations I had had of you.
Right.
Right. And I think this is where we shortchange parent education, right? So from the beginning, we should, in a lot of parenting classes, which many of us take, there's not really a lot talking about how to make sure you're parenting with the expectation that your kid could be cis or trans, that your kid could be straight or bi or lesbian or gay. these things aren't really coming up in the parenting education manuals, right? So I think parents are oftentimes having to deal with their own loss of expectation, maybe even a grief. If I feel like I birthed a male, but now this male is identifying as female, it's almost like I've lost my son, right? Or I've lost my daughter. Or, if you're going non-binary, it's like you have all these expectations. And so I think where we really lack resources and education are as to parents. For example, how typical is it if you're quote unquote a boy to be asked as a 6-year-old, oh, do you have any girl crushes? Do you have any girlfriends?
Right. Or
Who's
even for a
asking?
toddler to be told like, oh, that's a lady killer right there. Like that's a 3-year-old child. That's not a lady
Right.
killer.
Right. So why aren't we making those kinds of comments that more inclusive of gender or orientation, if that makes sense? I don't know. Do you want to respond to anything I'm saying?
Yeah, I think the one thing I do really want to touch on is this idea of grief. When it comes to this sense that you've lost the child that you thought you would have. And that is a problem that a lot of trans people experience with their parents, is this like mourning process, which for us is very strange because it's like, I'm still here. It feels very weird to have people mourning a person that is still around, that nothing has changed about them except for how they are identifying their name and their pronouns, how they look. Those things all change in people all the time. You could get your hair dyed pink. Am I gonna mourn the loss of your brown hair? It's I recognize that people set up expectations, and I think that inherently that is a problem, that people, if they're going to be parents, then you have to be along for the ride. You can't think about like, I can't wait for 22 years from now when my kid will be a college graduate, because you don't know if they'll be a college graduate. You don't know if that'll be the path they want to go down. And if you go your whole life telling them that that's what's expected, then there's going to be shame if that's not the path they choose. And it's the same exact thing with being trans. If you go your whole life telling your kid, I expect you, I'm so excited for you to be an adult woman. I can't wait for that to happen. It's like, it hasn't happened yet, so why are you making the assumption? And how hurtful is it going to be to both parties if that assumption doesn't come true?
Yeah, which is a total paradigm shift on parenting.
Yeah.
Including the paradigm shift, which I think we've talked about before too, that our kids are kind of supposed to be taking care of our feelings as parents, right? That it's a kid's job to be polite, to be respectful, to be kind, to be well behaved, right? All these things that we kind of expect. Sometimes it feels like we expect our kids to be able to emotionally regulate more than we expect ourselves to emotionally regulate, right? Like, stop having a tantrum or whatever when we don't look at our own kind of behaviors. So I think that's a paradigm shift that is taking place in more than just the realm of sexual orientation and gender identity, but where it's like, no, kids have a right to their emotional expression. Kids have a right to their own identity development. Kids have a right to some self-determination, obviously. Obviously, parents still have to kind of guide and lead, and especially depending on the age, make decisions for their children. But pretty quickly, kids are there's a lot that you can trust in your children that they know about themselves. And so that's all parent drama. Right. That's all parent drama too. And so I know I definitely felt it. I definitely felt my own discomfort, my own physiological response to when you were telling me that, like telling myself in the car, calm down, Natasha, like breathe, make sure you're affirming, they're telling you something important here. Like I remember thinking all of those things and I still messed it up. And it's interesting too, and maybe you can talk about this too. Like when I talk to a lot of parents, and I've thought about this myself, when kids come to us with labels, right? Like I'm gay or I'm queer or I'm trans, there's this kind of, there is this kind of difficult space where a parent is like, how much does this kid really know themselves? How much life experience do they have? You know, how many options have they been able to explore in life before they start making decisions about themselves? So there's that kind of idea. And of course, parents a lot of times think, well, I know my kid better than my kid knows themselves, right? Because we have this kind of idea that we are wise or that we have more life experience, or we want you to have a lot of different ideas in your life before you just kind of decide, you know, this is the way. And I think that's what I was trying to convey to you when you were talking about being bisexual. The way I remember it, and I may not have this right, is that I think I said something like, well, that's fine if you are. And, you know, I was trying to do the yes, and there are people that explore different sexual orientations. And, you know, throughout the course of their life, they may not always consider themselves bisexual or gay or lesbian or straight. The issue that I see with that now for me, that like how I would challenge me or other parents to think about that, is that when my kids are straight, I'm not having that discussion with them, right? I'm not saying, well, you may want to consider not labeling yourself as straight because there's a lot of rainbow out there. And you may want to consider trying a few things out, right? Before you just decide that you're straight. So if we're going to go down that route, I think we should go down that route for all kiddos, and we tend to do it only for queer kiddos. Is that fair?
Oh, absolutely. I would also say that in the society that we live in right now, where I think, you know, it's starting to become more accepted to be queer. There's definitely a lot more support now than 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, right? Like we've made massive amounts of progress, but there's still so much stigma, especially when it comes to intimate relationships, because it's easy to be an ally from a distance. It's harder to be an ally when it's someone that you know personally or are family members with. Given all of that, given how difficult it is to accept people within your close realm for their queer identity, if a kid comes to you, if anyone comes to you and says that they have chosen this label for themselves, know that they have thought about that they have agonized over that decision to talk to you about it. It's not a whim sort of decision. It's not like, you know, they wake up and go, oh yeah, I feel gay today, I'm gonna go tell mom that I feel gay. I hope that in the future it can be like that. Like that's what I would love to see, is a kid waking up in the morning and being able to tell their dad or their mom, like, I think that I'm queer, and they're like, oh, okay, sure, kiddo, and then go on with your life, and they can change it tomorrow, and that's fine. But that's not where our society is. So everyone has thought about it for so long before they make that decision to come out.
Right, which is a lot of times what we're minimizing for children or teens, is that they haven't thought about it enough, or they're not mature enough to make these decisions, when in reality, what you're saying is, no, these are things that have been well thought out, that have been, you know, like you said, agonized over, etc. All right, so then we get to my next big faux pas, which was using your dead name, just because I was timing it chronologically in my head, and so that was not appropriate. And what I want to add too, around the same time that I did that, when we were having these conversations, and I do make mistakes with your pronouns even today, and I'm so sorry about that, while at the same time I'm also trying to just make room for my 50-plus-year-old brain, plus the fact that I call your brothers all the wrong names. I call everybody the wrong name about a lot of things, just ridiculously. I remember my parents calling me and my sister the wrong names, and we were like, why is that? But it's a thing. It's a brain thing, not on purpose. We're all kind of dealing with probably early dementia issues. However, one thing that you told me, which was very helpful at the time, and this was a while ago, this is pretty close to your coming out process, which I didn't really think about, is you challenged me. You asked me, how do you talk about me, or how do you think about me when I'm not in the room? Mm-hmm. Right? So it's one thing that, oh, Rowan is here in front of me, I have to remember to use their correct pronouns. I have to remember to use their correct name. This is how they see themselves. Make sure I'm supportive of that. It was a whole nother process to be like, no, this is my kid. This is my non-binary kid. This is now, even in my own brain, I'm going to start using the correct pronouns. We had been using correct pronouns when we talked about you, kind of like when you weren't around. We had been doing that like in our household. And yet it was kind of like a shift to think about it. But what am I doing subconsciously or, consciously when I think about this person? It's almost like learning a different language, right? Like I remember when I went to Argentina after having spent so many years kind of here in the States, and the day that I woke up going, oh, I just dreamt in Spanish. Like I just, like I did it enough. I did enough of the practice that I'm actually now dreaming it. And it's kind of more in my subconscious. And so that invitation to see you no longer as, a woman, right? Or a girl, that I had seen you as for so many years was very helpful, was very powerful. That that's not who this person is anymore. That's not how they identify. And so although I still make mistakes, it's not because it really is it's like I dream about you now as a non-binary person, right? So that's come with that practice of putting that into place. What else? What other maybe advice or thoughts do you want to give to parents, especially, right? Because we're roasting parents today. So
well, I do want to touch on what you said really quick, because I love that analogy of it being like a language shift. I don't know if I ever dreamed in Spanish, but I definitely started thinking in Spanish when I went to Argentina, and it was a massive shift, and I was so proud of myself to be able to think things out in a different language. And so there's an exercise that that I found on like Facebook or something, where it's just every time you misgender someone, whether it's out loud or in your head, just pick 3 sentences to say about this person using their correct pronouns very intentionally in your head or out loud, whichever you prefer, right? If you get something wrong, then you pause and you go, okay, he looks very nice today. He drives this kind of car. I like when he makes me breakfast, right? Like very intentionally practicing that. That way it doesn't seem like it's not a hard thing to do. 3 sentences is pretty simple, but it is good. It is good to help you get your subconscious into that way of thinking. And I think it's important to recognize that, I think for me and for a lot of people, when we are misgendered by strangers, when I'm misgendered by strangers, I know that is because they see me as a woman. And so when I'm misgendered by people, I tend to have that thought of, is this because of a slip of the tongue, or is this because they still view me as a woman? And I would say for most people who misgender me, it is because they view me as a woman. So that's why it is so painful to be misgendered. That's why it hurts so much, is because it feels like kind of a constant invalidation, or a recognizing that you're never going to be truly accepted, right? Which is very difficult to come to terms with, that I think parents especially need to be really aware of if they want to be supportive, if they want to have a trans kid trust them and want to maintain contact with them. Then you have to make that subconscious change, and it's okay if it takes time, but after a while, like there's a turning point, right? If it's been 10 years and you're still getting pronouns wrong, it's pretty rough. You should look at yourself in the mirror a bit and really consider what you need to do to be better.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think too, what something you said earlier is kind of, if your gender or your sexual orientation, which is your identity, is not appropriate for children, right? We see this a lot of times whenever there's a new Disney movie or whatever, and there's a scene, I think there's just a recent one where there's like parents who are lesbian or gay, I'm not exactly sure which one. That scene is, we're sexualizing the children. We're sexualizing the children because we're informing them or just offering them different lives, right? Different diversity of people. Then we're sexualizing them. That's a very interesting kind of reaction from many aspects of society. Like when I had said, oh, this isn't an appropriate topic to bring up in front of your LDS friends, right? Because I was dealing with my own anxiety about what they might overhear or go home and tell their parents about, or how I would talk to you about that topic. So yeah, I think one of the challenges that we're really kind of putting forward here is this isn't about sex. This is about people and how they identify, just like whether it's cultural or ethnic or religious. You wouldn't say, well, that's not appropriate to even know about these different types of people because you're a child, right? Do you want to say anything else about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in a lot of ways, especially in the US, which is where I have the most knowledge about how we do things culturally, but we do have those feelings about other groups, right? When I was a kid, I didn't see very many Black people in cartoons or on screen. There wasn't a lot of accessibility for viewing people who weren't just white, cis, straight people. And I think that it's something that is really problematic in so many different aspects, that we view experiencing the lives of people who are different from us as somehow inappropriate. I've never quite understood why. Yeah, I don't really get it. I think that parents will be really surprised to know that their kids are capable of understanding a lot of things, that there is so much benefit to allowing your kid to have things normalized, because then when they're older, when they have friends who might come out as queer, or they have friends who don't fit into their socioeconomic status, or they aren't exactly the same race, right? Like, they're not going to have initial reactions that might make it hard to develop a friendship or a relationship amongst those people. I think that it's similar to the talks of consent, right? Like, we talk about teaching your kids consent from an early age, teaching them how to, say, no, I don't want you to hug me right now, or I don't want you to give me a kiss on the cheek, from a young age. That way they feel that sort of sense of purpose and that sense of self, that they're allowed to be in control of their bodies. It's a very similar thing. If you just make it simple, they understand it. You can make it more complex later if you want to, but it's not hard for kids to know what these things mean.
Yeah. Well, and I think now you're hitting on, I think a big reason why is because it's very fear driven, right? If we normalize certain things, or if we're accepting of certain things, and that will give kids permission to be certain things. And for a lot of people still, the idea that your kid might be trans or not straight is very threatening, very scary, which is a very unfortunate cultural climate we're currently in. Instead of welcoming diversity or seeing diversity as kind of a beautiful thing, and allowing our kids to self-determine and figure out what religion they're going to, even something as simple as religious affiliation. A lot of times parents don't want to think about their kids not following their own, their religious tradition, or even political, ideology, right? That my kid would think politically different than me. These are things that parents are afraid of. And many aspects of society and groupthink kind of specifically encourage these kinds of discriminations because of that. So it is very upsetting and sad, especially for people on the margins who need acceptance, who need validation, who need understanding, because that's what makes mental health for everybody go better, etc. So, all right, you shared a song with me that was very emotional and very, like, I don't know, beautiful. You're kind of a songwriter and a singer and a little bit of a player of guitar. Not that you're a professional or anything, but we're gonna play that song as part of this interview. Our sound audio is probably not the best, but we're gonna play it anyway. And as we're listening to the song, just be thinking of anything else you feel like I didn't either ask you about, or things that you'd like to say, but as we close up. But for now, we're going to play this song called My Mother's Nose. And it's a bit of a song that just talks about kind of how you see yourself and your brothers and things of that in kind of this gender identity perspective. All right, let's see how this works.
I really hate my face, or do I only hate the way it makes you see me? It is soft with sturdy jaw, a bit more plump now than it was when I was young. Oh, my eyes are set down nicely, and I have my mother's nose. Frankly, I have her almost everything, her smile, her laugh, her toes. Do I really hate my face, or do I only hate the way it makes me hurt? Would I like being her better if these features were assigned different at birth? Do I really hate my face, or do I only hate the way it's not my brother's? Theirs are soft with sturdy jaws, covered in hair I'm jealous of. God is so rude. Oh, their eyes are set down nicely, and they have my mother's nose. They don't exactly have her everything, but we all look so close. Do I really hate my face, or do I only hate the way it makes them him? God, I'd like it so much better if these features weren't doled out on a whim.
Yeah, that's emotional. Lots of people say that you look like me.
Yeah, it's
I'm
a
the
comment I get quite
I'm
a
the
bit.
vagina owner in the group, so so there's pain in that for you.
There is, and I wish there wasn't, because I think that part of that song is trying to say that like the features, like having your nose is something I share with my brothers. So why do I hate it just because my particular way of having your nose makes me look like a girl, right? So it's a weird thing trying to reconcile that I do like how I look, but how I look is a barrier between me and the outside world, me and strangers who will always see me as a woman unless I medically transition. So yeah, it's a weird thing to kind of grapple with. But I think that if people are listening who are trans, I want you to know that you are beautiful and you are handsome and you are stunning, and whichever word you want to choose there that fits with you, please choose it, because um it doesn't matter if we fit into the norm. We don't have to. Nobody has to. And parents recognize that being outside of the norm is really cool and really fun and really exciting to explore. Let your kids explore that. Let your kids not be the normal that you saw for them.
Yeah, I think that I mean the parts of the song that kind of make me chuckle, but they're so profound. It's like, well, stop God being so rude. and, and these kind of traits being doled out at a whim, right? And it's so true that unless you want to go through kind of medical or hormonal transitions of some sort, for some people are kind of maybe more natural and ambiguous, but for other people it's like these traits like an Adam's apple or breasts or certain features of a face that are considered feminine or masculine. Like these traits, we have been trained from very early on to immediately gender a person, right? And for people, especially on the non-binary track of things, it's like, I don't want to be gendered either masculine or feminine. Or if you don't pass in some way, that somehow it's kind of like another worthiness test, right?
Yeah.
It's another worthiness test of whether or not you're masculine or feminine enough. And we're so stuck on this binary aspect of gender as a culture that it's just very, very difficult and challenging for anyone, I think, on the trans umbrella, but also especially those who are non-binary.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Because there's no way for people to look at someone and assume non-binary with how our society has been set up. Actually, it was a while back, I saw like some TikTok of a person who had top surgery. So they had their breast tissue removed. And you get the choice basically of whether or not you want to have the nipples attached. And most people keep their nipples, but this person said, no, I don't want them because men have nipples and women have nipples, and I'm non-binary, so I'm not gonna have nipples because that's something that's different about me. But it's interesting. There's nothing like that for non-binary people that people can look at and think that you are the gender that you identify as. And it's sad that that means that we'll never be gendered properly. Right. I guess not never, but most people won't gender us properly.
Yeah, which is kind of like what you've alluded to. It's kind of exhausting and it's invalidating to have to consistently correct people and to advocate for yourself in a way that really those of us who have cis privilege don't even know what that's like.
Right.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the program today. I am super appreciative, especially because you're my own kiddo, to have you here. I hope I've been open, to my mistakes, and I hope that I've been apologetic, and not only open and apologetic, but being proactive about correcting the ways that I have operated or still operate. It's an ongoing process, and I guess I would just encourage parents to be willing to have these harder conversations with your kids. It's not fun. It's not fun to admit when you make a mistake. It's not fun to see yourself. I've always seen myself as progressive and accepting. And then it's like, wait a minute, I haven't been progressive and accepting. In some ways I was not at all. So those are not necessarily fun things to face with your kids, but I think it can be such a relationship builder to repair or to be willing to listen and to continue dialogue and conversation, which is very important. And to do that in a way that it doesn't put the burden more on the LGBTQ plus person than ourselves, right? That we really need to understand our own privilege if we are a straight cis parent. So thank you, Rowan.
Thank you, Mom.
And keeping your awesome self. And I'm just super proud and thrilled that you're my kiddo. So thanks.
This has been really fun.
All right. Take care.
You too.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. You can find Natasha on Facebook at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CSTS, and at Natasha Helfer MFT on Instagram and TikTok. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for this episode is by Otter Creek. This podcast was edited by Ashley Pacini.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. No tishki say the no, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. Of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. No tishki say the no, so we can to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Some places should be left alone. Något ikke skete noget. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart.